If you listened to my last episode, it was kind of a downer. After listening to it, you may not want to eat food for fear of foodborne illness. There is a reason for the FDA and the USDA and other agencies that regulate our food and our environment. We tend to take our safety for granted and walk around innocently, not realizing potential threats to our health. Or, as we learned, innocently buying raw milk for our kids because we think it has helpful immunoglobulins. Fortunately, there are people whose job it is to be vigilant. One of them is Dr. Seema Shah, the medical director of epidemiology and immunization services in San Diego County, and she's the interim deputy health officer. She's going to take us behind the scenes to share what disease investigators do and how they protect our kids' health. I'm Dr. Wendy Hunter, and I'm the pediatrician next door. I'm that doctor friend you call for practical advice about your kids' health. I mix the science of medicine with the reality of parenting. As you recall, every jurisdiction has rules governing which diseases and toxins have to be reported by schools, doctors, laboratories, and even veterinarians. The entire healthcare industry participates in disease surveillance by reporting what they see, and then investigators look for trends in this reporting. While we go about our daily business, it's Dr. Seema Shah's job to keep an eye, for example, on your daycare and to track down food handlers that may be contributing to a series of people getting sick. What exactly is going on behind the scenes? How do kids get caught up in foodborne illness outbreaks? And are they more prone than adults? Here is more of our interview. Are there any measures that you try to take at schools or daycares to prevent outbreaks?
So when we start to detect things like Shigella or Salmonella, part of our process, like whenever we see a positive like that, part of our interview process is to understand if a person is a daycare worker or a food handler. And so they're actually not allowed to return to work until they actually have clearance testing. So that's something that's interesting in the background that people don't realize. That is part of the public health kind of realm. So what we do is actually want to make sure that because we want to prevent outbreaks and further spread of infection, that is one of the disease control measures that we put into place. So especially in daycares where you can see a lot of Shigella or really any of those kind of disease outbreaks, and then food handlers in particular can be problematic, right? Because no matter how much you try to wash your hands, you still, there's always going to be dirty hands that get into food and can spread very quickly.
What about vegetables and fruits? I feel like a lot of my patients get sick. Well, I guess that's not exactly what I mean. Kids seem to get more intestinal bacterial illnesses from raw foods than adults do. Is that true? Like I see strawberries and lettuce. Or maybe it's just because I'm a pediatrician and I don't see adults.
I don't think that they get more disproportionately. Certainly kids are going to be at higher risk because there are certain diseases like E. coli, right? Because they're at higher risk from getting HUS, like the complications from the bacteria if they were to get. But the proportion, if you think about the population proportions and who's eating those, I don't know if they're necessarily getting more sick. I think if you're thinking about two groups and exposed equally and who was more likely to get more sick, it's always going to be kids. When there are outbreaks at restaurants, when we see them, interestingly, like we've had a number of oyster outbreaks in San Diego lately. A lot of that has to do with warming waters and changes in climate, and oysters are really taking the brunt of, and we continue to eat them raw, and so that becomes problematic. But kids don't typically eat raw oysters. It's usually they're getting infected because they're secondarily infected from parents in the household who've eaten the raw oysters. But really everything else, it's usually they're part of a larger outbreak that has occurred in a restaurant, like they're eating meals with the family, or they've been in a daycare or school situation where there's been food prepared, but they're not particularly susceptible to any other kind of food.
So it's not particularly a food, but it's often more of a setting.
It's more often a setting that has occurred.
Or food handling practices.
Yeah. And we've had certain, where there's been lettuce that has had E. coli, right? You've seen the recalls, right? Or
Mhm.
there have been allergens detected in foods, or we've had strawberries with Hep A. But luckily, some of this stuff is getting to be a little bit less of an issue for kids because kids are now vaccinated against Hep A, so less of an issue for kids.
Well, but a lot of them aren't. So a lot of people in my practice do skip the hepatitis A vaccine because they think their kids aren't at risk, but that's not true.
Yeah, it's honestly, and especially in a border county like ours. I mean, we've had a number of hepatitis A outbreaks, and it's and we've seen the genomic analysis. It's people travel back and forth. We see that it shows up in our food sources, and I think that this is going to continue to be a problem as with our climate, with changing impacts on our food supply. And so things like, something that's preventable like Hep A that's an easy one, right? Get vaccinated. So if you travel or if things like, for example, the frozen strawberries that we had a number of cases in 2022. And that was, from Costco. They were frozen strawberries from Costco, something that you would think is very routine. You pick it up in your freezer and you make smoothies. But that is a pretty significant food supply issue, right?
And it had hepatitis A in the
And it
strawberries.
had hepatitis A in those strawberries. And we were able to do trace back, but that will land you in the hospital, right? You can get very, very sick from it. We do genomic sequencing so we can actually tie back very quickly and see where the exact source is. Not all the time, but it's gotten very sophisticated so where you can see, but sometimes that can take weeks before we find out where that source can come from.
They are a department of 300 people in epidemiology, and they are responsible for not only gastrointestinal illnesses, but all the respiratory illnesses too, and diseases you can get from, say, insects. Really, any disease that is infectious, they track, as well as many other ailments like lead poisoning and drug overdoses. How do they monitor for the next harm that might come to us? They have lots of strategies. Here's one.
We actually have a system called syndromic surveillance that we do in the background of all of our regional hospitals. And in the background, we can actually look at chief complaint data every single day where we monitor to look for any kind of deviation from that. And that includes anything from GI type symptoms to respiratory to neurologic. And what we're looking for is a sudden change in that, like change of 2 standard deviations and that gives us a sense that if there's suddenly an aberration in our system, that we need to be checking into what's happening. Is there some kind of unusual activity, whether it's is there a virus? Is there an incident? Is there some sort of any epidemiologic event that we need to be looking into? So we also have a One Health epidemiology program where we're looking for spillover events between animal and human health. So we've been working on trying to understand that interface. So for example, looking for when we see Brucella is a good example where when we see a Brucella case in human, we try to track back and actually test animals or even, around a particular human to see if there are connections and look at actually doing genomic analysis there to make those connections like spillover events.
Brucella is an example of what epidemiologists call a spillover event. Brucella is a bacteria that causes the disease brucellosis. Brucella primarily infects livestock like cattle, sheep, and goats, and swine. Humans can contract Brucella through direct contact with infected animals or animal products. Things like handling livestock or assisting with animal births or coming into contact with aborted fetuses, as well as consuming unpasteurized dairy from infected animals. Again, this includes raw milk, cheese, and other dairy products. Humans can also get Brucella by inhaling aerosols containing Brucella bacteria in a lab setting or a slaughterhouse or farm. So it's a great example of the concept of zoonotic transmission, where a pathogen moves from animals to humans, obviously posing a significant public health challenge. Managing brucella uses something called the One Health approach, which integrates human, animal, and environmental health strategies to control and prevent spillover. So we need to pasteurize dairy products and use proper animal handling practices, as well as vaccinate livestock and educate about the issue. Another way that our health officials protect us is by sampling our wastewater to look for increases in diseases. You may have heard about this as a method to monitor COVID. It's also known as wastewater-based epidemiology. It's like digging through your neighbor's trash to find out what they're up to. Samples are taken from water treatment plants, sewers, and even from individual buildings sometimes to look for things like pharmaceutical drugs, how much opioid is in a city, and other diseases like norovirus and polio. Can you talk a little bit more about how you surveil wastewater?
Yeah, so there's a couple different things that we do. So we actually have a contract with UCSD in which we're doing COVID wastewater testing. There's a nationwide surveillance going on with wastewater scan program, and they do a number of different tests, including influenza, human metapneumovirus. They're actually also looking for H5N1 in wastewater right now. Obviously, COVID, RSV. And we started doing this. Well, COVID, we started actually analyzing back in 2020. So we've actually got one of the most robust data systems around wastewater and COVID, actually in the US, period. So we have actually more than 4 years worth of data now. And really, it's a good kind of subtle measure. Even recently, for example, we're up to 10% testing positivity for COVID, which you've noticed like everyone around you has suddenly started testing positive. It's not a surprise because our wastewater is also showing signs of increases. So, and especially as PCR testing went away, wastewater has really been another epidemiologic data point for us. Not a singular, but it really serves as a secondary measure to say, hey, this is what's happening. And it really helps us to message to the public on where we are, because we are having an early summer surge. We what we would typically have a late summer surge, right now we're having an early summer surge. So I think that these are data points that are critical as we move into this unusual virus that is still not showing a very typical pattern, a winter style pattern like all of our other respiratory viruses.
Wastewater surveillance helps epidemiologists stay ahead of the game. It gives a clue to what is going on in an entire population. And just so you know, Dr. Shah doesn't actually dig through sewage herself. Her job is way more fun than that. She mostly looks at data all day. What's your favorite part of your job?
I love the solving mystery piece because it does bring me back to my ED days. Like when we find that, when you have that moment where you're like, yes, we found it, because it's so satisfying and you can help the public in a very short period. Like, that you can affect so many lives so fast.
So what's next for this disease hunter? What keeps her up at night? Literally probably nothing, because I happen to know she has seen it all the scary things, and nothing gets under her skin. But what is she worrying about on our behalf?
The number one disease that is always worrisome is West Nile virus, right? So I'm going to knock on wood. I'm going to do that because we're very worried. We are expected to have one of our busiest seasons this year because we've had very heavy rainfall. We do have a very big Culex mosquito population here this year, but we have not detected West Nile yet, and we have not had a human case yet, and we have not detected otherwise. So nothing on West Nile yet, but we're expecting that to show up. I have to say our vector control is amazing. I mean, they've been really aggressive this season. If you look at our news stories, like they have been already doing lots of aerial drops and larvicide and larvicide treatments, and really just trying to be aggressive about going after the mosquitoes. We see a lot of travel associated dengue, malaria. Those are not unusual for us. We have been preparing for ultimately a locally acquired dengue case. They have had it in Long Beach and Pasadena last year, which has got everyone spun up, because once you have a locally acquired case, you put your entire population at risk. And it's it sounds scary, like one case, but the amount of public health resource that goes into disease control it's a big deal. That means that you have now introduced a case that could potentially affect a lot of different people. And that, again, has to do with, as climate changes, as things warm, as those mosquitoes, become more comfortable in their environment, they're going to spread that disease. And that's why when we detect, and that's why it's important as healthcare providers, people who travel and come back with symptoms and things, that are concerning for dengue, malaria, chikungunya, Zika, you send that testing off, because once we see that, we actually set traps around their home to test for those mosquitoes to see if, during their infectious period, did any of those mosquitoes pick up that disease, right? So that's actually a very important public health measure that we do.
That is fascinating to me. It would never have occurred to me that if a patient has, say, dengue fever and they're staying at home, a mosquito could go bite them, pick up a disease, go have sex or whatever they do with other mosquitoes, and infect our bug population with a new disease. I'm going to be a little bit more careful about wearing my insect repellent, because bug bites aren't just annoying, they can be dangerous.
You actually do need to make sure that you put your DEET on. Especially like at this time of year. Of course, it's getting hot, but make sure that putting on your DEET is really important.
Yeah, insect repellents are really very safe for kids, and the spray ones work much, much better than like stickers and wristbands.
They really do.
Natural botanical oils. This really don't work.
They don't work. And especially for ticks. And actually, one of my colleagues sent me a picture recently and was like, I found a tick. What do I do? And I said, nothing to do. Monitor for symptoms, make sure, you remove the tick completely, so that, so there's some really great videos online on how to remove a tick. So knowing, it's a great skill for any parent to do, but it's interesting. Actually, I just saw I was at an epidemiology conference last week, and they were talking about what do people on the West Coast do when they see a tick, and most of them go to an urgent care and ER, whereas everybody on the East Coast goes to like their primary care provider and just takes care of it at home, right? Here's the difference between coasts. But really, there's some great videos online on how to do tick removal. It's really safe. It's very easy to do, but just making sure, again, prevention is better. But if you don't prevent, but make sure that you know how to remove, and if you can't, you're not comfortable going to your provider to get it removed. We are constantly looking for things like Lyme disease or Rickettsial disease. It's just part of what our standardized surveillance looks like, because our counterparts across the border are seeing a ton of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. That's actually really important for the healthcare providers here to know, that if you see somebody from across the border who happens to show up in your clinic, think about that. That is actually quite a few kids are dying across the border from Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And we've actually put out some health alerts and whatnot to really just to bring awareness to that. But a lot of their ticks are testing positive, but luckily our ticks have not tested positive here to that degree.
I hope that this information helps you sleep better, knowing that there are teams of hundreds of people in every community across our nation keeping an eye out for threats to your health. For more from the Pediatrician Next Door, find me on the web at pediatriciannextdoorpodcast.com. If you've got a question about the weird things kids do, send an email to hello@pediatriciannextdoorpodcast.com for a chance to hear your voice on the show. I'm Dr. Wendy Hunter, and I'm the Pediatrician Next Door. This show is produced by Red Rock Music. Make sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever it is you're listening. I'll be back next time with more.